And now, while we're here, we might as well debunk some potential exercises that many of you may be doing for your back training that might not necessarily be as good as you perhaps think they are. The lab coat is on, which can only mean one thing. Today we're going to learn some stuff, we're going to science some stuff, and we're going to grow some stuff. Because ultimately this is the next installment on the TFNL Growth Guide, and we're actually looking at the back. I'll tell you one thing, it's a bloody spicy one. Visual stimulus everywhere. What a dream. Before we crack on with the video, I'm going to make a deal with you. Just a very quick one. If at any point throughout this video you decide that you actually managed to learn something from this video, then please do consider liking the video, as 1,300 likes is our like target, and also subscribe to the channel by clicking the red button down below. But only if you learn something. On top of that, if you have a question that you want me to answer at the end of my next video, then drop it down below in the comment section for comment question of the week, and I shall do so. Probably the fastest intro ever. We're going to crack on with it. As always, timestamps will be listed below, so you can skip forward to bits and bobs if you want to. And like I said, we're going to be talking about the back. And there are a few areas that we're not going to place too much emphasis on. So for example, the rear delts, we're not going to place a lot of emphasis on because I kind of covered that in our shoulder video. And also the lower back, like the erectors. And I'm going to explain that towards the end. You'll see why. So obviously there are many muscles of the back. So obviously going from the top to bottom, as you can see, there are loads. The main ones people typically consider when they're thinking about the back are often the traps, the tres major, the rhomboids, and the lats, so the latissimus dorsi. Those are kind of the big ones you typically think about when you're thinking about the back. And oftentimes we split that into upper, middle, lower back, just based on obviously segments of the back. But we'll simplify it a bit and we'll kind of look at some key ones here. And the big ones we're going to really focus on, like I said, we will touch on the rear delts and we will touch on the traps. But the big ones we're really going to focus on, and we'll kind of hover around the rhomboids, but the lats, so the latissimus dorsi, is going to be the fundamental talking point of this video. And the lats are essentially that, as you can see, that big thick muscle down here. And although the lats is considered one muscle, we do typically split it into 3 fibre divisions. So the upper lat will be considered the thoracic fibres, the middle lat more the lumbar fibres, and the lower lat, which is arguably, I believe, the largest fibre division of the lats, will be the iliac fibres. So when looking at the traps, for example, the big things you probably associate the traps to are typically elevation and retraction. When looking at the lats, for example, down there, you're typically looking at extension, adduction and medial rotation of the upper limb. So the big thing typically there is thinking that adduction of the upper limb, so doing movements in which the upper arm is close to the body. And the rhomboids essentially retract and rotate the scapula. Those are a couple of the primary functions of the muscles we're going to be looking at today. But we're going to kind of go into some training bits and bobs now. So when looking at the lats, for example, this muscle here, we're typically thinking about doing any kind of movement that involves you pulling with the upper arm close to the body. So that could be like a dumbbell row, that could be a low row, that could be a cable pull down, so many variations. But essentially let's take it a bit further and let's think about, okay, well, how can we place greater emphasis on the different fibre divisions of the lats? So essentially the way I kind of see it is, you'll probably see on screen now, is a line of pull. So on the screen now, you'll probably see an iliac pull down, which is essentially a pull down that targets the iliac fibres a bit more. And you'll notice that there'll be a line drawing from the cable machine all the way down, kind of highlighting the line of pull and the fibre divisions it's placing greater emphasis on. So high to low is typically iliac fibre. Then on screen now you'll see more of a lumbar row. Mid to mid is typically going to be more lumbar fibres. And now you're going to see more of a low to high row. And because we're going low to high and the line of pull is typically going towards the upper lat, we're thus targeting the thoracic lat fibres a bit more. Typically what will essentially determine the division of the lats you are placing greater emphasis on is going to be the angle of your armpit, basically. So essentially the angle of shoulder flexion. If it's, let's say, about 120 degrees at the armpit, we typically look at iliac fibres, hence high to low. Let's say about 90 degrees at the armpit, we're typically looking at, like I said, mid fibres, so the lumbar fibres. So let's say about 60 degrees at the armpit, so a little bit lower. We're typically then looking at the upper fibres of the lats, being the thoracic fibres. So if you're pulling from high, you're probably working low. If you're pulling from mid, you're probably working mid. If you're pulling from low, you're probably working high. It's kind of like opposites. Think about that line of pull. And then we can take it a little bit further if we want to, and then we can look at things like lengthened versus shortened position. The lats are at their shortest when your upper arm is in line with your body. So just like so, Lats are now at their shortest because my upper arm is in line with my body. So when people are saying, oh, they're doing these rows and they're pulling that arm all the way back, you don't need to do that if you're trying to place more emphasis on the lats, because like I said, your lats do shorten when it's in line with the body. Taking the upper arm further back from that, you're essentially bringing in other muscles of the mid-back, etc, etc. But then we think about, well, Harry, you've mentioned lengthened and shortened position movements before. Let's tickle those. So the lats do seem to benefit from being trained in their lengthened position, thus benefiting from stretch-mediated hypertrophy, as well as obviously their shortened position, thus benefiting from metabolite accumulation. When I'm working the shortened position, as you'll see on screen now, regardless of what variation I'm doing, being that an iliac pull down, being that a lumbar row, being that a thoracic row, whatever it may be, I'm typically pretty dead set facing the cable, like so. I am pulling directly kind of head on. What you will notice I'll do is I may lean back slightly whilst ensuring I'm maintaining a neutral spine, and by that I mean I'm not arching, I'm keeping neutral but leaning back, and also I may lean ever so slightly to the side I'm trying to work, because one of the kind of assistant functions of the lats is slight lateral flexion of the spine. So that's why I tend to typically, like I said, lean ever so slightly towards that working side. But if I'm kind of head on, I'm typically working the shortened position, just like so. So you're the cable machine, that's typically shortened position. If I were to turn away from the cable machine, so working side, further away from the cable machine, like so, as you'll see on screen now, I'm typically working more of the lengthened position, in which more tension is being placed during this lengthened portion, less so in that shortened position. So that's essentially a pretty easy way of figuring out lengthened versus shortened position is, if you head on and you can fully shorten the lats by bringing the upper arm in line with the body, shortened position. If you're a bit turned away, stretching the lat out a bit more, typically a bit more lengthened position. It doesn't need to be much deeper than that for a lot of people, but all I would typically say is just when looking at training the lats, you want to think about keeping that upper arm tucked in and close to the body. If it comes further away from the body, you then start thinking about other back muscles. Essentially, the further and further away we come from the body, the higher and higher up the back we tend to be working. So like I say, close together like so, typically lats. About 45 degrees, we might typically bias a bit more of the rear delts, for example. About 90 degrees, we might be looking more of the traps and the rhomboids. Now we talk about things like grip. People say, well, what grip should I use when training the back? And I say this in a lot of my videos, but I'll kind of keep it there, is that typically if you are training the back, it's something in which your grip is going to be tested and may end up being a limiting factor, then I would definitely encourage using straps to then remove that weak link of grip, thus allowing you to train the back a bit more effectively. You've got three primary grips to consider. You've got pronated, so overhand, you've got neutral, so obviously neutral, and supinated, so underhand. Starting low, when doing lat bias movements where the upper arm wants to be close to the body, I would typically do them with a neutral grip, because if you've got overhand grip, you can't really keep your upper arm close to the body anymore, and by default it will tend to flare. So for the lats we want to typically favour a neutral grip. Then a lot of people say, well Harry, what about underhand grip, so the supinated grip? Again, you can do a supinated grip if you want, but typically when you do underhand grip movements, your biceps get even more involved than they already are, which could potentially result in them being a limiting factor, as your biceps may fatigue before your lats do. So that's why we typically say neutral grip. When doing like a 45-degree row, so let's say for the rear delts, whatever it may be, typically I would have my hands about 45 degrees, so that kind of like semi-pronated grip. And when doing an upper back row, so 90 degrees, I would typically have my hands overhand, so pronated, like so, lats, like so, rear delts 45 degrees, like so, upper back, traps, rhomboids, 90 degrees. You've bloody nailed hand positioning without even needing to think about it. And now, while we're here, we might as well debunk some potential exercises that many of you may be doing for your back training that might not necessarily be as good as you perhaps think they are. And I've got three that come to mind. This kind of goes into my kind of almost like tier list, my preferred movements, we'll say. The three movements we're going to kind of, I say, debunk to some extent. The lat pull down, the barbell row, and the deadlift. I know what you're thinking. Oh wow, Harry's going to rustle some feathers right now. And you're bloody well right, I am. So essentially, the lat pull down isn't actually as amazing for the lats as you might think. Because typically, like I said, when we're doing a lat movement, we don't really want our kind of armpit angle, so shoulder flexion here, to exceed about 120 degrees or so. When you're doing a lat pull down, you're near enough at 180. It's kind of more of like a mid to upper back pull down, because you're kind of bringing like the teres major, the rhomboids a bit more, all those kind of bits and bobs. It's not as effective for the lats as you might think, which is why I typically favour a single arm cable pull down, because you have much more control over the arm angle. The other thing to consider with the lat pull down is if the primary function of your lats, or one of them, is to adduct to the body, so bring your upper arm close to the body. Doing so with an overhand grip, it's going to be really hard to bring that upper arm close to the body. You're typically going to want to flare, like so. That's not particularly ideal for the lats, you see. And now we go into the barbell row. Barbell row, you're typically limited to two things, overhand or underhand. So either overhand, not ideal for the lats, underhand, biceps may fatigue before the lats. But then you would think about doing a barbell row. If I say do a set of barbell rows to failure, what is going to fail first? Is it going to be your upper back muscles? Is it going to be your lats? Or is it going to be something like your erectors, so lower back, and maybe even your breathing and core? Probably your erectors, breathing, or core. So doing a movement like the barbell row which isn't chest supported is typically going to be less favourable for the lats because other variables may prevent you from training the intended musculature effectively. Because if you're trying to do your barbell rows and your lower back gives out before your mid to upper back gives out, then ultimately, have you trained that mid to upper back within close proximity to failure, or have you actually just taken the lower back to failure? So again, it limits effectiveness of the muscles you're trying to work. And the same thing kind of works with the deadlift. So obviously, a lot of people have this idea that the deadlift is a fantastic movement for the lats. But ultimately, there is obviously some contraction occurring, therefore some work occurring. But when thinking about deadlifts, is you typically think about what range of motion are you actually going through, and does that range of motion necessarily align with the function of the lats, for example? Probably not. Because again, your arms aren't really moving, you're just standing up with the weight. Therefore, the lats aren't really going through a sufficient range of motion, nor a lot of the upper back muscles either. Again, I'm not saying it's necessarily bad, I'm saying it's probably not as good as you might think. And that probably aligns quite well with the thumbnail. I feel like the thumbnail should probably be a deadlift and something to talk about why it's not great. You'll see, you'll see. And also the other thing to consider is, with the deadlift, it's a very hard movement. It's a movement that takes you a long time to recover from. So the fatigue is very high, but the stimulus is relatively low. Therefore, the stimulus to fatigue ratio isn't particularly favourable because you're getting very tired without getting a lot of work done in the target muscles. Therefore, it would make more sense to do something that's maybe chest supported, where the fatigue is a bit lower and the stimulus is higher, but you're also able to take the target muscles through their intended range of motion without other variables holding you back, like your lower back, etc, etc. What movements would I include? Essentially, it's any movement that aligns with what I've said previously. Any movement that allows you to take the muscles to, if not close to, failure without other variables holding you back, like your lower back, breathing, etc. And also any movement that allows your arm to travel in the direction that you want it to based on the muscles you're trying to target. So for the lats, I've already shown you 3 fantastic examples that essentially target all 3 fibre divisions of the lats. So for the posterior delts, for example, you could do either like a cable reverse fly, or you could do a 45-degree row, which you're probably seeing on screen now. And for the traps and the rhomboids, simply just upper back rows, like so. Any variation of those, it doesn't have to be on a cable machine, it can be on a plate loaded machine, it can be chest supported with dumbbells, chest supported with a barbell, it could be with a barbell or dumbbell without chest support if you so wish, although like I said, I probably wouldn't favour that. Options are endless. Again, the lat pull down is a great movement, but maybe not so great for the lat, so I could definitely chuck that in for more like the mid to upper back perhaps. And even again with the lat pull down, you can play around with grip, you can go overhand, you can go 45 degrees, so many things to play with. Well Harry, why are you not talking about the erectors? Why are you not talking about the lower back? Your lower back is so heavily utilised when you're doing a lot of other movements, especially like hip hinge movements. So if you do RDLs or stiff leg deadlifts, your lower back's getting absolutely battered. If you're also doing things like hyperextensions, things along those lines, barbell rows if you so wish, things like that, your lower back is getting absolutely battered. Therefore, if you're including sufficient movements that involve the lower back, specifically hip hinge movements like I said, the RDL and the stiff leg deadlift, I wouldn't typically place too much emphasis on trying to directly train the lower back, so the erector muscles, because like I said, they get so worked doing other bits and bobs. And it's also why I didn't bring in too much of the traps, because essentially the traps are very utilised when you're doing kind of any upper back rowing, because like I said, you are typically involved in the traps. You can do shrugs if you so wish. I feel like if you are going to do a shrug variation, Ryan Jones actually has a really good video on this, in which he does like shrugs at a 45-degree angle. That's probably a bit more favourable alternative. A lot of people probably aren't that fussed about training the traps because like I said, they're heavily worked indirectly. But then you think about, okay, well, you've given me some exercises, you've kind of taught me about lats, the rhomboids, all the good stuff, but what about an example back day? Well, typically I probably wouldn't do a back day, but if I were going to do a back day, I would kind of look at about 4 to 5 exercises, probably actually 4. I typically, like with most muscles, I'd try and look to train the back muscles probably about twice a week, and I'd have different workouts each day. So over the course of the week, you make sure you hit all 3 fibre divisions of the lats, sufficient upper back volume and sufficient rear delt volume as well. But what I would typically do, let's say for first back day, I would typically do 2 lat dominant movements targeting 2 different fibre divisions of the lats, so it could be iliac and lumbar, it could be iliac and thoracic, but I would typically try and include an iliac dominant movement in both of them, purely because I believe the iliac kind of fibre division is the largest fibre division, so therefore probably want to place a bit more emphasis on it. And then on your other back day, you could maybe do iliac and then the other fibre division you haven't targeted from the previous day. So you've got 2 lats movements there. Then you could typically do one movement in which you're rowing at 45 degrees, so a bit more posterior delt dominant. Then you can also do one movement in which you're rowing at 90 degrees, a bit more upper back dominant. I might do an iliac pull down, 2 sets of about 6 to 12. Then I might do a thoracic row, so low to high, 2 sets, similar rep range, about 6 to 12. Then I might go to a 45-degree dumbbell row on the chest, and I might typically, let's say, do about 3 sets of 10 to 15. Then I might do a wide grip row, maybe about 2 sets of about 10 to 15 as well. But typically how I would actually structure it is I wouldn't necessarily do a back day on its own. I would typically do a pull day in which I'm doing, let's say, about 4 back movements, so maybe a rear delt movement, an upper back movement, and 2 lat movements, and then maybe 1 or 2 bicep movements. There is no right or wrong, that's just merely a simple way of structuring it, depending on your weaknesses and your goals, obviously. When it comes to mobility, for example, you could certainly tickle including some mobility drills before your workouts, or perhaps even just at home if you so wish. So there could be movements like bird dogs, for example. You could tickle some cat-cows, some thread the needles. There are all these movements that you can do that essentially take you through a range of motion that essentially gets your body moving a bit more freely. That is it. That is our hopefully relatively simplified growth guide on back training, and hopefully you're able to take at least something away from that. And if you did, then obviously you know what the deal is. A cheeky like and maybe even a cheeky subscription, if you so wish. But now obviously we're going to crack on with comment question of the week, and again, as per, it's a bloody good one. As a mum of 3 young children, I have to keep my workouts quick. You've stated that you aren't a huge fan of supersets, but how would you suggest to structure a superset workout so that I can get good results but still keep my workout time low? I'm currently doing home workouts and do not have access to a gym. So typically if I were to do supersets, I would kind of work it more towards like compound sets. So doing 2 movements that target the same muscle group but in different positions. If you're doing a superset of, let's say, quads and hamstrings, your stimulus for the quads is here, your stimulus for the hamstrings is here, but your fatigue is up here. If you were to do, let's say, 2 quad movements back to back, stimulus for the quads is obviously going to be a lot higher, therefore kind of balancing out the stimulus to fatigue ratio because your fatigue is also going to be higher from doing 2 movements back to back. Typically work your supersets around 2 of the same muscles, so like quads and quads, hamstrings, triceps, etc, etc. But if you can, like I said, try and target different positions, so maybe shorten position first because we typically fatigue in the shorten position, and then lengthen position afterwards. But in all honesty, at the end of the day, it's not that much of a stress whether you do shorten position versus lengthen position, especially if you're at home and you're trying to keep just your workouts quick. Then I would just typically just try and really focus on 2 movements of the same muscle group back to back. You don't even have to do that if you don't want to. Like I've said before many moons ago, I would typically favour supersets if I'm doing 2 movements of the same muscle group back to back. But also the other kind of excuse and reasoning I gave behind potentially favouring supersets would be if you're pressed for time. And you are very much pressed for time, as you've stated. Therefore, any superset that essentially reduces the duration of your workout is going to be effective for you because time limitations are a big concern. So don't worry about it too much. You have plenty of options. That is it. That is the video. If at any point, like I said at the start of the video, you maybe even learnt something from the video, please do consider liking the video. For obviously 1,300 likes is the goal on this video, and also potentially clicking the red button down below to subscribe to the channel, and maybe even the bell next to it so you get notified when I upload every week, twice a week. And if you too have a question you want me to answer at the end of the next video, please do consider drop it down below for comment question of the week, and I shall do so. Thank you for tolerating me. Thank you for tolerating my interesting, cheap, and also a little bit itchy lab coat, and thank you for tolerating the video.